Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. Our esteemed guests offer unique insights and analysis that you won't find anywhere else. In this week's episode, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Waterloo, Dr. Alexander Lanoszka discusses Wagner Group's attempted coup in Russia over the weekend and how it might impact discussions at the upcoming Vilnius summit concerning Ukraine's NATO bid. What the events of last week mean for Putin, Russia's domestic politics, and how Canada and the international community should act to uphold stability in the region in the face of potential further erosion of Russian stability. This is the Expert Series. Well, thanks for joining me again. It's always great having you on. I imagine you're pretty busy, so I appreciate you taking some time to talk to CDA.
Well, thank you very much for having me again.
What's being called a coup happened, I believe, last Friday now in Russia with Wagner Group and Prigozhin. It's been almost a week since, so maybe we could start by going over maybe what factors contributed to this turnaround of the Wagner Group troops during their march on Moscow, and what you think it reveals about the dynamics within the Russian military and security apparatus.
Sure. So we have known for some time that there has been a disunity of military command within Russian forces operating in Ukraine. Indeed, one of the particular characteristics of the so-called special military operation launched on the 24th of February is how the different regional commands were in charge of their own operations as they poured into Ukraine. So dysfunction or disunity were already features of the full-scale invasion from the outset. Of course, with the participation of so-called private military companies like the Wagner Group, that sort of disunity has become all the more obvious, in part because as much as they do depend on the Ministry of Defense for ammunition supplies, logistics, and so forth, they have been operating, it seems, in rather independent fashion. We see Bakhmut being a flashpoint for Wagner forces in particular. Over the course of the last several months, Prigozhin, the founder and head of the Wagner Group, charged that the Ministry of Defense was incompetent and inept, and more problematically, from his perspective, had withheld the provision of ammunition and munitions to forces belonging to the Wagner Group. He had been steadily crossing over various red lines in terms of his criticism of Russia's civilian authorities. He has pointed much of the criticism towards the military leadership, in particular, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov. And things came to a head last Thursday, Friday, when he basically disabused spectators on the channel of the official reasons for the full-scale invasion. There was apparently an MOD-backed missile strike on Wagner's positions in Ukraine, and that set in train the taking of the city of Rostov, which is where the Southern Military District is headquartered in Russia, and then, of course, the march on Moscow itself. You mentioned the very abrupt turnaround of the March of Justice, as Prigozhin had called it, a march of justice, as it were, that consisted of a convoy, perhaps a battalion-sized convoy, headed towards the city of Moscow. They got into the Oblast of Moscow, and Prigozhin very suddenly had announced that some sort of deal was struck and that Wagner forces would be returning to the barracks, as it were. We don't really know why Prigozhin would take Putin's word for anything, considering the chronic inability of the Putinist regime to abide by deals and to make honest goodwill gestures. And so I can't really tell you what really went into it. What we do know at that time is that Prigozhin did receive certain security guarantees. How reliable, credible those were is another matter. And that Wagner forces would not necessarily be subject to particular criminal proceedings, that it may be folded into MOD force structure. But again, there was a lot of uncertainty about the nature of the security guarantees, and indeed the relationship between the Wagner forces and the MOD. What we do know is that Prigozhin and Wagner forces seem to be moving to Belarus as part of this deal, but precisely because Wagner remains armed and that there are serious cracks within the Russian military leadership as a result of this particular affair, this is an issue that's probably far from over.
What would you say are the potential implications of this short-lived rebellion for the stability and security of Russia, based on what we know?
Right. So I should have mentioned that one aim of the so-called March of Justice was to remove the particular leaders in question, namely Shoigu and Gerasimov. These still are in power. There does seem to be credible reports that the Russian General Surovikin, who is called General Armageddon, has been arrested and detained. He has been seen as one of the more competent, if not ruthless, Russian generals. To what extent that's true is debatable, but it does reveal, again, the major cracks within the Russian military core, in addition to the deep crisis that does rack Russian civil military relations. It is important to note that Russia does not really have a history of coups. There have been coups over the course of the last 200 or so years, but almost everyone that you can name, whether it's the Decembrists in the early 19th century, the Kornilov affair during the First World War, the August 1991 coup, in addition to this one, they're all were failures. And indeed, Russia has a strong history of civilian control of the military. But it does reveal, again, that fragmentation within the Russian military. And I think that is useful for Ukraine, in part because it makes it harder for Russia to coordinate various military activities to sustain high morale. Indeed, there are credible reports that Russian troop morale is very low. These sorts of crises can only make things worse. Obviously, had the March of Justice, again, so-called March of Justice, had proceeded and not ended as abruptly as it did, and had that indeed result in an intensification of armed hostilities between regular Russian forces on the one hand and Wagner forces on the other hand, then that certainly would have been very disruptive to Russia's ability to continue fighting in Ukraine. What does seem to be the case, that Wagner forces are withdrawing from the Ukrainian military theater of operations, that could actually hinder the ability of Russia to mount further offensive operations. And as such, the best that Russia could possibly do now is to hold on to what territory it currently controls within Ukraine itself. These Wagner forces, as much as they were made up of convicts, were still some of the more combat credible forces that Russia had at its disposal. And so them leaving the picture, as it were, will further empower Ukraine to go about undertaking operations in association with its counteroffensive operations, however complex and difficult those operations may be.
If we might be able to explore a little deeper some of the implications that this attempted coup might have for Russia's campaign in Ukraine, especially considering how pivotal Wagner Group has been for Russia.
Yeah, I mean, to clarify, I'm not sure if it was really a coup. Yes, some of the discourse that Prigozhin had used over the course of the crisis did involve a stepped-up attack on Putin's leadership himself. It seemed more as a mutiny. Some people would say it was a fight between various gang elements intended to ensure that the Wagner Group would not be disarmed and folded into regular MOD forces. But again, the episode certainly is revealing insofar as it showed the dysfunction that characterizes the Russian military leadership, the grave distrust that now exists between military leaders on the one hand and political leaders on the other hand. Indeed, the possible arrest of Surovikin is indicative in this regard. It's very easy now for Ukraine or for even its Western partners to undertake psychological operations aimed at sowing more discord and distrust within Russia. It's certainly more possible to undermine Russian troop morale, not least because they really are on the back foot in Russia itself. It looks like, at least in certain sectors of the front line, Ukraine is starting to take territory, although they're doing it perhaps a little more gradually and incrementally than what many have expected. So in general, it is good news for Ukraine. It's a hard war. It's very difficult for Ukraine. It's been a very traumatic and challenging process. But this sort of dysfunction almost never goes well for the regime in question. And I think precisely because it suggests a new phase, a terminal phase even, in Putin's own rule of the country, that the regime will have more and more difficulties in trying to adjudicate between competing power structures, that a weakness is now perceptible amongst people like Putin, by people within Russian society or Russian elite class itself, in a way that, again, would be very disruptive to Russia's ability to go about complex military operations in Ukraine.
The day of and days after this event occurred, I was seeing headlines along the lines of how must the UK prepare, how must the West prepare, how must Europe prepare for potential Russian state collapse. Now, with that in mind, considering the volatile and unpredictable nature of the situations, what steps do you think the international community, including Canada and our allies, need to take to address the potential ramifications resulting from this and help maintain stability in the region?
Right. Well, I would certainly hope, if nothing else, that European Union countries are thinking about the possibility of major refugee flows that could result from a significant conflagration happening within Russian borders. We've already seen Latvia, for example, tighten its visa regime to bar Russians from entering the country. So I would hope to see more advanced crisis management planning in that regard. It's also an opportunity to figure out where exactly Putin's so-called red lines really are. This episode revealed that the ability of the Russian military to defend its own cities, let alone its own border, is under serious question, that Putin, in fact, sought to de-escalate by striking some sort of deal with Prigozhin, who, in all accounts, committed severe treachery. And so the most important thing as regards to the war is really the ability of Ukraine to liberate the territory that is currently under Russian military occupation, and to do so at the smallest cost possible, notwithstanding how difficult counteroffensive operations truly are. And so with this new information about the ability of the Russian military to conduct basic tasks, in addition to the Russian political leadership being in severe crisis, this should allow ourselves to overcome what hesitation we have to provide certain supplies and military gear that would allow, again, Ukraine to go about those counteroffensive operations to liberate those territories that have been under Russian occupation since at least 2022, if not much earlier.
The Vilnius summit obviously coming up in about just less than 2 weeks. How should NATO think about Ukrainian membership after the events of the past week? And is this going to influence discussions at the upcoming NATO summit, in your opinion?
I don't think it will influence discussions about Ukraine's prospective membership with regards to NATO. I think there remains dissensus within the alliance about whether Ukraine should be a member. And because NATO is a consensus-based organization comprising 31 going on 32 members, it would be very difficult to achieve that degree of unanimity required. I think there have been some news reports of select countries within NATO offering some sort of bilateral guarantees or assurances to Ukraine to ensure a steady amount of political, military, and technical support. Whether that is something that Ukraine will want or will find satisfactory remains open to question. My suspicion is that Ukraine will be able to join NATO when it is let me take it back. Ukraine will probably be able to join NATO when it has probably the least need for NATO. And that will be a time when it probably might expel Russian forces from at least a large share of its territory. And the Russian military threat is such that Ukraine is able to defend largely that territory that it does control, hopefully most of it, if not all of it, under international law, without the significant support of that comes with an alliance commitment.
Well, Alexander, thanks for joining us again. Really appreciate it. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts on any of the topics we've discussed, or perhaps there's something you'd like to highlight we didn't discuss that you think is important?
Sure. I suppose with respect to the Vilnius summit, one thing I'll be looking to see is whether the alliance finally decides to let go of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. This was an agreement struck in 1997 between NATO on the one hand and the Russian Federation on the other hand, that sought to provide some sort of roadmap for them having cooperative relations. And as part of the Founding Act, there was the promise that NATO would not position substantial combat forces on the territory of those countries that would join the alliance after that date. Of course, those countries being former Warsaw Pacts and Soviet bloc countries more generally that are now part of NATO. And NATO has been very faithful to the Founding Act, even with the deployment of the enhanced forward presence, these battalion size now almost brigade size, or at least aspirationally brigade size forces positioned Poland, the Baltic countries, and various other countries on the alliance's so-called eastern flank. Because of the Founding Act, the numbers have been circumscribed, and more importantly, the forces deployed forward in those countries have to be there on a rotational basis. They cannot be there permanently. However, I've seen last week an announcement by Germany of its willingness to position a permanent or permanent-like brigade in Lithuania, where Germany is the framework nation for the local enhanced forward presence. That suggests that even the Germans, who have been supportive of the Founding Act for a long time, are now moving away from that particular position. So I'll be very interested to see whether the alliance finally determines that the Founding Act is no more in light of the security environment. That would allow the enhanced forward presence to take on a permanent character rather than the rotational character that it has. There are benefits to having rotational forces, but permanent forces have more reassurance value. The soldiers and the families of those soldiers prefer permanency over rotational deployments. The costs are lesser, as a matter of fact, and it's actually easier on the host nation forces themselves because they don't have to keep training in various rigorous certification processes over a 4 to 6 month period. So just getting away from the NATO-Russia Founding Act would be a very positive move that will rebound to the security of the alliance. I hope that Germany's recent announcement about the permanent-like brigade in Lithuania is a suggestion that such a disavowal will indeed take place at the Vilnius summit.
Thanks again, Alexander. I always enjoy talking to you, and thanks for coming on again and providing your insights on all of these topics. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to having you on again in the future. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.